Okay, so I think we're ready for our next talk of the evening. It's going to be given by Professor Andy Clark, who's a professor at the School of Philosophy here. And he's going to be talking about being in computing. Are you your brain, or is your brain a computer? And it's a brain computer. Professor Clark has been working in philosophy of mind for many years, and he is most famous for developing, or one of the things he's famous for developing is the extended mind view, which is that our minds can extend beyond our heads. Maybe not.
I'll do it.
All right. So, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Cool. Okay, well, I do absolutely hate following Seth. I really do, because everything that I'm about to say has a better illustration, I think, than something that Seth has just done. But here we go anyway, let's go through it. Basically what I'm going to do, tell you a bunch of my favourite stories about embodiment, mind and extension. Some of those will be familiar, very familiar to some of you. And then about sort of 3/4 of the way through, I'll kind of switch gear, try and say something about some stuff which it was actually there in what Seth was saying. It's been there earlier today in what Murray Shanahan was saying, and suggest that maybe there might just be hints in this later stuff of a kind of fundamental theory about the earlier stuff. So basically, I guess what I think is earlier approaches to embodiment and cognition are a kind of nice bunch of anecdotes, and it might take something more to put it on the road to be in something like a systematic science. And I'm hoping that the sort of few comments at the end point in that direction. So that's the plan, anyway. Right, okay, thank you, Eden. Okay, so mostly I'm going to be talking about the being bit. I'll be talking about why bodily form, action and the local environment really matter, what huge differences they make to us as, if you like, cognitive engines. I'll also say just a little bit about computing, about why the human brain, which is in there somewhere, doing something important, if it is some sort of computer, looks to be a rather weird kind of computer. Basically, a computing device which is persistently proactive, one which is continuously trying to predict the incoming stream of sensory inputs. So the kind of hope is, putting that together with some of the earlier pictures, might end up in a unified picture. I won't deliver that, but that's a hope, so maybe one day that will get delivered. Okay, so being, a bit about that. The key idea here, I think, is that control and information processing aren't restricted to the brain or the central nervous system. That should have been CNS, not CNC. Instead, maybe bodily and environmental structure and activity can do all kinds of work. And we saw some of this in some of Sethu's examples. But so let's consider something more basic, something like just controlling two-legged locomotion. Not a very easy task. Honda's Asimo does some of this. Some of you will have seen Asimo. There's a little fragment of it in Sethu's talk. Asimo is a very advanced humanoid robot, possibly still the best humanoid robot on the planet. 26 degrees of freedom. But there's something clunky about Asimo. When you watch Asimo in motion, there's still something clunky about Asimo. What might it be? Maybe what it is that it's not exploiting its own embodiment to the full. So there's a kind of issue. When can you make the most of your own embodiment? So think about energy efficiency. You can measure this by something called the specific cost of transport, which is the amount of energy required to carry a unit weight, a unit distance. What's good about that measure is that it sort of washes over anything about your own body weight. So you can be good at this despite being heavy, if you like. So it doesn't sort of discriminate against big heavy robots. But if you score Asimo on this, 3.2, that's not good. The lower the score, the better. Score a human on this, 0.2. That's very good. So what's going on? Looks as if what's going on is that in Asimo, Asimo is kind of working too hard to do the job in a certain way. Each joint has a motor and control assembly, and Asimo isn't benefiting from the swing of its own legs. Not, for example, the way that in Sethu's stuff there, the baseball pitcher was benefiting from the swing of its own arm. So Asimo's body, if you like, is kind of like just one more problem to be solved. So the first thing that I want to put on the table, just as, again, it was coming out in Sethu's talk, is that the body can be part of the solution. So if you compare Azimuth with a bunch of other things, passive dynamic walkers, you can begin to sort of appreciate the difference. Passive dynamic walkers don't have any power, except gravity. They don't calculate joint angle control. But if you put them on a gentle surface, they look quite good. So they create a kind of stable, human-looking walk-in. There's a third-generation passive dynamic walker. It's got kind of, you can see how it might benefit from the swing of its arms, the weights on its arms, the curvature of the feet there. Here's that. So you could also ask how you build on this kind of fluency in a powered walking device. One thing that you can do then is try and take all of those sort of passive dynamics, the stuff that you're kind of getting for free from the bodily form, and find a controller for that sort of pushes and nudges and tweaks that system, making the most of all of those dynamics. And I think there again, that's something that you saw a nice example of in the swinging sort of baseball throwing arm. So here's actually just an ordinary passive dynamic walker in the Cornell lab. That's just got no actuation at all. This is an old piece of film. I think it's quite, if you look at the kind of the walking gait there, this thing has absolutely nothing except its bodily form and being on this gentle slope. And actually, it's probably walking better than the guy that's walking with it. And then there was a whole flurry then of robots coming out of the MIT robot lab that, as it were, tried to combine powered locomotion, a kind of nudge and tweak style control, and these sorts of passive dynamics. There's one of my favourites, RoboToddler, that actually was able to learn it could learn the control policy that would make the most of its own passive dynamics. It could do stuff like adapt to treadmills where one of the treads was actually moving at a different speed to the other. Pretty cool stuff. And here's a very early example that I just love, the bouncing hopping robot from the MIT Leg Lab, which again combines sort of rich bodily dynamics and these simple forms of control. This is just a joyful robot, you've got to like this. Yeah, we could let that loop forever. So okay, moving on with a few more of these sorts of morals. This is a puppy robot from Rolf Pfeiffer and Ida back in 2006. Puppy is, well, this is what Puppy does. It doesn't look terribly impressive, kind of wanders along there. But the point that I'm going to bring out of this is just that if you look at Puppy's feet there, they're kind of very basic little sort of little aluminium feet. So they're nothing very fancy there. You might think, well, we could fancy up the feet. But actually, if you fancy up the feet and give Puppy little sort of rubber feet, Puppy just falls over. So it turns out that the low-tech aluminium legs and feet were playing quite an important role. The role that they were playing really was to allow Puppy's feet to sort of slip around on the surface until with that sort of forward-going controller, it would automatically find a spot that was stable enough to move forward on. So reducing the slippage by adding kind of fancier feet just caused Puppy to fall over. So there's something interesting here about materials, the relation between materials and environments, and the importance of getting the right fit between materials, environments, and control strategies. Okay. So what's going on there in a way is that kind of the bodily form, the materials that these things are made of, plus the kind of biomechanical stuff like the passive dynamics and so on, creates, if you like, a sort of uneven landscape for the controller to learn to control. So the controller can then, if you like, find sort of minimal strategies that make the most of the things which are already provided by materials and by biomechanics. So for example, there are sort of a number of stable minimal energy expenditure gates that are available for those kinds of systems, like in us, jumping, running, walking, trotting, skipping. Those are kind of stable gates that we can get into, given our bodily biomechanics, given the materials that we're made of. So to control bodies like ours, you can have controllers that try to make the most of that. Okay. So, I can jump on. So these are all cases of what Pfeiffer and Bongard in their nice 2007 book called morphological computation. Quote from them, bodies can perform functions that would otherwise have to be performed by brains. So that's a kind of first sort of moral that I think I want to put on the table there. In those cases, you could say there's a sense in which control and processing are kind of leaking into the body. Bodily shape, the materials, the biomechanical linkages, the passive dynamics, they're simplifying the neural commands required to bring about quite complicated behaviours. So I think of that as control and processing leaking into the body. This will be important in the end when we think about the mind. So a quick look at action now. So moving into action, the thought is that it's not just growth form, biomechanics, passive dynamics that might be doing unexpected work, but also just the skilled use of the body in action. So one sort of key contribution, I think, here is the notion of actively self-structuring our own data flows. So moving around in the world in ways that bring into being flows of information that then help us to solve problems. So here's BabyBot. BabyBot is Meta and Fitzpatrick's work. One of the things that BabyBot does is can learn about object boundaries by poking and shoving. So basically what goes on with BabyBot is it sort of moves its own, in this particular learning case, it can sweep its own arm in front of it. There's a kind of motion signature that it expects there. But if it then gets a kind of a sort of a big expansion, a growing expansion in the visual field, then what that indicates is that it's come across an object, that it's pushed an object around on the table in front of it. So searching for spread of visually detected motion there enables BabyBot, as it were, to use motion to discover the presence of an object in front of it. So there were some nice videos of that I couldn't actually make work, so we won't get the videos. But so the idea is that there are these informative sensory motor correlations. A sudden motion spread helps you identify object boundaries, and we do a lot of this. We poke the world, we prod it, we intervene in all kinds of ways to improve our own data flows. So it's not just a trick for babies. We humans, I guess, are rampant self-structurers of our own data flows. And I think this is something which is kind of slightly weird about us that we need to look harder at. So there's a sort of sense in which when you self-structure your own data flow, you're not just a sort of passive input-output machine. You're not just sort of waiting there for something to come at you and processing information. You're bringing into being the streams of information that might enable you to learn better, to perform better, and so on. So think about higher cognition. Think about the things that we humans do in higher cognition. We do some weird stuff. We sketch, we scribble, we gesture, we offload stuff onto pages, we re-inspect the stuff which we put out on the pages. In all these cases, what you can think of is that we're creating these structured flows of information that somehow help us to solve problems. Even though we brought those flows into being, you might think that when you draw a sketch, well, you must have already kind of understood it because you drew it. But we do this all the time. We draw something, then we have a look at it. We move our problem solving along. So there's some nice case studies of this. One of them that I've looked at and enjoyed very much in the past is the role of physical gesture in thinking. So there's some interesting work suggesting that spontaneous gesture isn't just a sort of outflow of the system when it's engaged in trying to communicate, but instead could be part of the actual process of thinking, if you like. So the idea is that spontaneous gesture is somehow doing cognitive work. There's actually I'll get to the experiments in a minute. So there are clues that maybe it might be doing more than communicative work. We do spontaneous gesture when we talk on the phone, we do it when we talk to ourselves, we do it in the dark when nobody can see. Gesturing apparently increases, I can vouch for this, when genuinely reasoning about a problem rather than merely describing a known solution. So when you see someone gesture a lot, you might think, well, that's just sort of, hand waving. It might suggest they're really thinking about it, in fact. This is just part of, as it were, it's part of the cognitive apparatus, and you can see it in action. Speakers blind from birth, who have never spoken to a visible listener, never seen others moving their hands as they speak, they also gesture when they speak. And they do that even when they're talking to others that are known to be blind. So there are clues there that gesture might be, in some way, part of an integrated system that sort of springs into action anyway. There's also a bunch of nice experiments, which I've suppressed to make room for the stuff at the end of this talk, but basically what they show is that if you suppress the ability to gesture, you interfere with the ability to do certain cognitive tasks. So, getting children to sit on their hands as they talk you through their solution to a problem interferes with their problem solving, for example. So there's some idea here that gesture has some sort of cognitive value. And I think a possible model of that is that it's a bit like sketching. When you gesture, you bring something physical into being. That something physical that you brought into being is then available to drive your own processing along, to augment or alter your own processing. So Daniel Dennett sometimes talks about the power of cognitive self-stimulation. I think this is probably one of those cases. We do something, and that something feeds into our own neural processing systems, and it's that overall system that is the problem-solving system. So this is a kind of thin end of the extended mind wedge, in my opinion at least. Iverson and Thalen back in 1999 have a nice picture of this. They say, speech, gesture and neural activity continuously inform and are informed by each other, together constituting a single integrated system. So this is the notion of these superficially disparate things being so deeply coupled together as to form what's effectively a single problem-solving system. As they say, a dynamic mutuality involving words, gestures and neural activity, so that activity in any one component can potentially entrain activity in any other. Or McNeil, quite explicit about this, the gesture, the actual motion of the gesture itself, is a dimension of the thinking. And that's a claim that I would want to defend. So there's a general picture here. Gesture is just one example. Sketching, sketching while you think, writing equations down while you do mathematics. These would all be examples that fall in the same kind of ballpark. The idea would be that self-generated motor activity is a complement to neural information processing that brings into being new cognitive wholes. This is from Mungerella and Spawns. Information structuring by motor activity and information processing by the neural system are continuously linked through sensory motor loops. So the kind of minds that we have seem to be minds that are somehow kind of always poised to make the most of body and world, sort of bringing them into these sort of unified problem-solving ensembles. And it's not obvious that every artificial intelligence would be like that. Maybe we could design and build things that don't work that way. If we did, they'd probably be intelligent systems, but not intelligence as we know it. So second moral of the embodied mind, cognition leaks into these whole perception-action loops. So if that's true, then the engine of these kinds of cognition is not just a naked brain. It's a whole complex, the brain in concert with the sensing, acting, moving body. What we now need to do is get the world into this equation. I've already given many hints about how to get the world in, so let's just do that bit. So here's a very old example of mine, but one that I do still like. The bluefin tuna puzzle. This is old work by the Triantafylou brothers, fluid dynamicists at MIT. So this is about bluefin tunas. Bluefin tunas are apparently fantastic aquatic animals. Their performances in some ways seem to outpace their basic physiological power. So I'm not entirely sure how this gets measured. Don't know quite how you measure the basic physiological power of a bluefin tuna. But apparently they shouldn't be able to go as fast as they do. They shouldn't be able to turn as sharply as they do. They're too weak by about a factor of 7 for some of their own performances. So how's it all working? Looks as if what the tuna do is they make the most of the world around them. So the tuna use naturally occurring eddies and vortices, so if there's a swirl in the water, the tuna can make the most of it. You might expect that. But more interestingly, maybe, they use their own tail flaps to create little vortices like that they can then sort of step into to blast off more quickly. So the tuna disturb the water and then make the most of the environment to turbocharge their own sort of blast off, for example. So again, that's sort of beginning to exploit the environment in the sort of way that Sethu's baseball thrower was exploiting dynamics of its own body. It's intervening on the environment to create these structures that you can then make the most of. Okay, and they tested it using a big anodized aluminium and lycra robot tuna. It's just what you want, there it is. So you can probably see where that's going. This is a kind of a softener for the extended mind kind of notion. Because if you now think about our own artifact-enhanced cognitive processing, I think that in a more cognitive domain, it looks very much like what the tuna is doing in the watery domain. So we use all kinds of external operations and media. We've got, iPhones, notepads, spreadsheets. And maybe what they're doing is extending and augmenting our cognitive capacities in much the way that the tuner, as it were, uses the water to augment its own physical capacities. So we write notes as we think, we re-inspect them later, we draw diagrams that we ourselves immediately inspect. The thought will be, this is, if you like, this is building larger cognitive machines that we make the most of. So this leads towards a strong claim. I haven't really given you the arguments for it here. All I've given you are the softeners. You're not going to get any arguments really here. But they were the softeners. The strong claim would be, it's not that all the real thinking happens inside the head and just loops into the body. It's all like the gesture case. In the gesture case you might think, look, the motion of the body is part of the thinking. If you allowed me that much, I think you'd be, as it were, poised to accept the rest of it, that in some of these other cases, what you're doing on notepads, spreadsheets, iPhones is actually part of the thinking as well. This is, anyway, just come back to the arguments about that in a minute. Okay, so the thought would be, loops into external media can come to form part and parcel of the integrated system for thinking that we call the mind. That's the Clark and Chalmers kind of extended mind claim. Avoid the naked brain fallacy, you get the idea. So why should we believe, I mean, would it matter if we did believe this? And why should we believe it? One argument that I don't often give, so I've suppressed all the sort of philosophical arguments for this today. I think there are some, they sort of turn on considerations of parity and integration and continuous coupling and so on. But here's another way of thinking about it. Let's take a case like Patrick Jones. Patrick Jones suffers severe memory impairments as a result of repeated traumatic brain injury. So basically, he sort of fell out the pram quite a lot as a kid, and then he rode mountain bikes, and he fell off the mountain bikes, and so repeated traumatic brain injuries resulted in him having the kind of sort of memory loss that you might have seen in the movie Memento, like that. So basically, he can't lay down new memories. Nonetheless, he's a Catholic deacon working in Colorado Springs, and he holds down a fairly normal kind of life as a Catholic deacon in some ways, some level of restriction. And not because of any really high-tech interventions. He uses a combination of Evernote, Curio, and an iPhone. And because of all that, as he moves through the world, he creates large interlinked sort of webs of structure in these external media. And they basically just have to play the role of keeping him oriented in his own projects, in what's going on in the world. If someone comes to see him, he has to, as it were, consult these webs of structure to try to get on top of who's who and what's what. There's a nice paper on this, what if HM, an old famous amnesiac case from the psycholiterature, had a BlackBerry. So, at one time, maybe just, 20 years ago, people with that kind of damage were institutionalized. Nowadays, people with that kind of damage aren't institutionalized. They can very often get by very well in the community. So it's only because of that whole up and running web of stuff running through all these external media and so on that he can recall who he's spoken to, what was decided on and so on. Nonetheless, he holds down the Catholic deaconship pretty well. So here's a claim that I want to make. Patrick the person is built now of biological and non-biological parts. Some of the non-biological bits not being even attached to his body. Some of it running through iPhones up into the cloud. If you were to hack into and destroy his Evernote records, I think that would be a crime against the person, not merely a crime against his cyber property. Tantamount, as Dan Dennett once said, to inflicting brain damage on somebody while they sleep. So I think earlier today, in Francis Egan's talk, there was a kind of thought that, well, the extended mind, that's pretty hard to swallow, but extended persons, that would be even harder to swallow. So, for whatever it's worth, I'm biting the extended person's bullet as hard as I can. And of course, you can see where that goes. If you happen to be sympathetic to that as a take on Patrick, you should be sympathetic to it as a take on you as well. Because your pens, papers, notebooks, diaries complement your basic biological information processing profile in the same way as this other stuff complements his. So if you think that he's a kind of extended mind hybrid system, then I think so are we. So that's the last moral of the embodied mind stuff. Cognition leaks not just into the body, but into the world. if that's right, some of what makes you you runs on new machines that are built out of resources that might span brain, body and world. And I've omitted some stuff here, and I'm just about to come to that, sort of move into the second gear of this talk. But what I've omitted from the first bit is other people. Didn't say anything about them, but of course they could be important parts of your overall cognitive economy on this story. And I've omitted all considerations concerning consciousness and emotion. You might think that somehow that doesn't get extended. You know, maybe everything that determines your conscious states is in the head, even if your cognitive states can bleed out into the world. I'm not saying anything about that here. Okay, so, story so far. Thought is, to understand real human cognition, we need to take seriously the ways in which cognition, control and processing are kind of bound up with body, action and world. And that if you just look at human beings, we really are a lot weirder than, if you like, we might at first appear. Think about a chess machine, for example, that kept talking to itself very softly while it was pondering the next move. Or an expert system where if you gave it a question, it had to print out a few sketches and have a look at them before it would proceed to try to answer your question. You know, you might think, well, it doesn't need to do that, it's got it. Whatever it's got in it, it's got in it. But we don't seem to be like that. We do all of these interventions. That suggests something about the shape of our own basic cognitive architecture, I think. It's an internal cognitive architecture that is built to kind of create unified wholes with other kind of external stuff and media. Okay. So that's the thought. We're on. We're like that. Okay, so that's the sort of old stories about embodiment, the kind of stuff that I've been doing for quite a while. So what I want to do now is just say a little bit about something else, and then towards the end just wonder how they fit together. So, you know, you might say, okay, what about the brain? You know, some people have listened to the extended mind kind of story and sort of thought that it means that brains don't matter. Like that. Well, of course, it was never supposed to mean that brains don't matter. So how should we think about the role of the brain in these complex brain-body-world systems? There's one possible answer. There's one that I used to actually believe. The answer would be, look, the brain is just a kind of box of tricks. Tricks that are maybe very neatly adapted to the specifics of our human body and to our particular environment. So, you know, it's a cool box of tricks. It can tune itself by lifetime learning and so on. But maybe there's, you know, just lots of different strategies in there. And in fact, Ross Ashby came up earlier today. One of the things that Ross Ashby said is, the brain has no gimmick, just 5 billion years of research and development, everything like this. Ross Ashby also said, although I haven't got it up here, the whole function of the brain can be summed up in 2 words, error correction. So he might have been sort of hedging his bets here a little bit. So there is that thought. Maybe the brain doesn't have any sort of core gimmick. Maybe it's just lots and lots of research and development. But there's another possibility. Maybe there is a sort of core gimmick. Something that might suggest that what's going on in the brain is a bit more unified than the adaptive grab bag image suggested. And if that were true, then maybe that would help with the kind of project of finding some core principles underlying all those messy webs of embodied interaction. Maybe if the brain did have a kind of gimmick that it liked, that would let us get systematically to grips with a lot of these cases that I think otherwise just look like a nice bag of anecdotes. Something like that. So I'm going to end with a few too brief thoughts on some recent developments that have sort of shifted me from a bag of tricks to a core gimmick kind of person. So the candidate core gimmick, if you prefer, unifying principle here is prediction. Brains like ours, on the emerging story that I just want to stick on the table, it came up in Cecil's talk, it's come up repeatedly today, it was all over Anil's talk. The thought is that brains like ours are multi-level sensory prediction machines. Some of the classic works here, Round Ballard 1999, Liam Mumford 2003, most recently Carl Friston picking this stuff up and running with it and doing all kinds of larger pictures with it. So what is that picture? It's a picture that is normally called something like hierarchical predictive processing, or predictive processing for short, or hierarchical predictive coding. I prefer predictive processing just because predictive coding suggests a simple data compression strategy and predictive processing suggests something more well, more like an actual processing strategy and not simply data compression. So these things turn, in a certain sense, a familiar view of perception upside down. What they're doing is rejecting what you could think of as a kind of cognitive couch potato view of the brain. The view in which the brain just kind of sits there, waiting for some stimulation to arrive from the world, starts to do some processing, and then issues a motor command or a judgment or whatever. So it would be a sort of input processing output model, where you very much got the picture of stuff coming from the world, hitting you, and you responding to it. Hierarchical predictive processing turns that on its head. Instead of building up your picture of how the world is on the basis of the incoming sensory data, what you do is you try and guess the incoming sensory data on the basis of your best model of how the world is. So that's the kind of, there's a sort of Bayesian twist in the story there. So the schema here is that successful perception happens when you successfully guess the incoming stream of sensory information, and when you successfully guess it using a multi-layer hierarchical system. The thought is that there are multiple concurrent bouts of signal passing in which some populations of cells send their predictions downwards. Those predictions meet the incoming sensory stream. Where there's a difference, you get a residual error signal, and prediction error flows through the system, which can recruit a better prediction, or it can drive learning to change the sort of underlying model from which the predictions are being made. I'll say this will just be a very, very, very quick sketch of this here. But brains like that are proactive. What's important about them is that they're constantly trying to predict, at many spatial and temporal scales, the sensory signals arriving across all modalities. So it's a kind of move towards a much more endogenously driven view of perception. It recalls, actually, the slogan coined by the vision scientist Ramesh Jain, perception as controlled hallucination. The thought would be, your brain's busy trying to guess what's out there, and to the extent that that guess matches, explains away the incoming sensory stream, you get to perceive the world. And in fact, I should have turned this thing on for that. I did. Amazing. But that illusion will look a lot better now. So you know that's a hollow mask. As you can probably see if I stick my hand into it. It will probably look like a face looking outwards to you. Certainly if you're on the right side of the room, it should. So you can see that, if you like, as a demonstration of how the same process might mislead. The strong prediction that you have that faces are convex and noses stick out is here trumping some of the incoming sensory information. So that the information that actually is there that specifies concavity is being trumped, if you like, by your top-down prediction of convexity. So the concavity specifying information is being treated as noise. Good. Now I can do another quick demo. Too many demos here. I'll turn that off because it's too noisy. Maybe one more demo of how quickly something like this can happen. So what I'm going to do now, unlucky, yeah. So what I'm going to do now is play a couple of clips of sine wave speech. So sine wave speech is ordinary speech that has been degraded by being stripped of most of its normal attributes. So what's left is a kind of a little sort of skeletal signal. So what I'll do is I'll play the skeletal version, then the original version, then the skeletal sine wave version again. What will happen is, once you're able to, if you like, get to grips with the sine wave version with apt prediction, it will sound very different to you. So let's see if that's going to work. Need to make sure I press the right button. Okay, that was the sine wave speech. Here comes the real one.
She cut with her knife.
And here comes the sine wave one again.
She cut with her knife.
So you should really hear, like phenomenologically, a huge difference. I'll do one more of these. Oh, you're good. Someone knows. Some people can just talk sine waves. They're like me. If you listen to enough of them, you can do that.
I think that's a compliment.
Kettle boiled quickly. Kettle boiled quickly.
Now I'm going to give you something harder. That was harder, wasn't it? So you can do something for that one. There we go. So try that. And here we go again. But so, you know, I think that does show what a rapid difference apt prediction can make to our experience. Of course, you might ask, how does the brain learn to make all those predictions in the first place? And one of the really cool things, I think, is that the prediction task, the task of trying to predict your own stream of sensory input, is a kind of bootstrap heaven. If you want to predict the next word in a sentence, it's really good if you know stuff about grammar. But if you want to learn a lot of stuff about grammar, a really good thing to do is to try again and again and again to predict the next word in a sentence. So you can use the prediction task to bootstrap your way using fairly well understood gradient descent learning means to the knowledge that you then use in the prediction task in future. So we learn about the world, if this kind of story is right, by constantly trying to predict our own sensory stimulations. Well, we learn about, you know, cats, tables, chairs, grammar, all of the things that are out there by just trying to predict our own change in ways of sensory stimulation. And of course, prediction-driven statistical learning works, and it's widely used in machine learning. So, just bring this back to embodied action, and then I'll stop. So one of the things that I think is interesting here is that the internal economy on these pictures becomes very, very tightly geared to the kinds of embodied interactions that I was talking about in the first half of the talk. Because we don't just passively predict the sensory stream. What we actually do is we move our bodies in order to try and bring that stream about. So this fits with that self-structuring of information flows notion. So the model of action in hierarchical predictive processing is that action is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. The brain predicts the trajectory of sensations that would happen were the action being performed, and it then cancels out the prediction errors by moving the body so as to bring that set of sensations into being. This is sort of making the world conform to the predictions. So if you like, predicting the flow of sensation that would result were you to move your body just right to stay on that sweet spot on the surfboard, results, if you happen to be a good surfer, in that very flow of action, cancelling out the prediction error, putting the surfboard just where you want it. So it's a kind of version of the idea-motor view of action, that, as it were, actions are brought into being by predictions of the sensory consequences of those very actions. So the thought here is that, dynamically speaking, the whole embodied active system is what's self-organising here to reduce errors in the prediction of sensory input. That delivers a grip on worldly causes, cats, cars, hurricanes, but it also simultaneously determines action, and so it helps select the ongoing stream of sensory stimulation. So as Aaron brought this to my attention again a few days ago, that this is a kind of rediscovery of a sort of principle that William Powers had back in the 70s, the thought of behaviour as being reconceptualised as a control of perception. So instead of thinking of, as it were, perception as a control of behaviour, just turn that on its head a bit. Think about your behaviour as a control of perception by having it select the next streams of sensory input. So I like this stuff, you know. I think this is a kind of model of brain function that is very rich, that bridges neuroscience and computational models, and that's really perfectly suited to the demands of real-world, real-time learning and action. I think it's actually, you know, the perfect complement to all the embodied cognition stuff that I've been talking about. Something I haven't mentioned, but I think it's hugely important, is that these models are also committed to minimalist forms of internal control. So basically they're looking for the minimal stuff that they can predict in order to, as it were, keep the systems in their sort of little window of viability. So you're looking to find the inner models, the forward models, that enable you to predict the salient aspects of the sensory stream using the fewest parameters. So it's applying what's sometimes called an Occam factor to the prediction task. So that's the other thing that I think would need to come on board if this stuff was going to be the perfect complement to embodied cognition, a good vision of the lazy predictive brain, as it were. The brain tries to predict as little as possible in order to get the job done. Okay, so I'll summarise and then we can stop and talk about it. So this is, why do I like predictive processing? I think there's at least a hint here of a fundamental theory that might link perception, action, learning and efficient forms of neural control. So, conclusions. Are you your brain? That was one of the questions up there. I'm going to go along with Susan Hurley on this. No, you're not your brain. What you are is a shifting dynamic entanglement involving brain, body and sometimes world. So that also means that you're not always the same thing, minute by minute. If you're one of these shifting dynamic entanglements, there's a sort of, there's something which is continuous as you move through the world, but it's not a particular little physical bit of the world. It's more like a kind of process of recruitment or something. So I think that would be a thought worth pursuing a little. And then, is your brain a computer? You might have noticed that I didn't address that question at all. And I think it's really because we could argue a long time, and I think fruitlessly, about the necessary conditions for being a computer, for being a computation, for being a computational solution to a problem. What I think we can say is that if you want to think of the brain as a computer, then at least notice that it's probably a pretty weird computer. It's a computer that is constantly buzzing, always, if you like, trying to predict the sensory streams before they hit it. So, it's a computer where an awful lot of stuff is going on endogenously all the time. And it suggests it's, more like an operating system, something like that. Something that is constantly buzzing, doing all kinds of tasks all the time. Okay, that's it. Thank you.